Hello, and welcome to Mint and Burn, the academic analysis of blockchain and other technologies in the decentralized digital economy. I'm your host, Kelsey Nabin, and we are tuning in remotely from the RMIT University Blockchain Innovation Hub to bring you interesting guests, publications, and experts to test frontier ideas. In this episode, we'll be speaking on the law and taxation of NFTs with Professor Marta Poblet, Dr. Aaron Lane, and Dr. Lizzie Morton from the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub. So this is our second part in a two-part special series. Last time we brought you a deeper dive into the culture and economics of NFTs, and I highly recommend that you go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. Today we're talking more about the legal and taxation questions and issues surrounding NFTs, noting by way of a disclaimer that this is not official advice and should not inform financial decisions. So on that note, welcome everyone, and I would love to get straight into the questions by starting with you, Aaron, to hear what are the current regulations surrounding NFTs?
Well, Kelsey, I think it's important to start out by saying that it's really the Wild West at the moment, I think, in terms of NFTs, in the sense that there is no specific regulation that applies to NFTs. The regulations that will apply will depend on what it is that the NFT kind of is and does and represents. And I think we can get into some of those broader questions about what rights, if any, might flow from ownership of an NFT. And so I think the regulation in this space will be at a general level. So if it is a security, I think that's unlikely. But if you had an NFT that kind of, was some sort of, wrapped security or something like that, then that will be regulated according to securities law. If your ownership of an NFT is wound up in some sort of managed investment scheme, then it's that managed investment scheme that will be regulated. So from that angle, it not only considers really what the regulation on the particular token might be, but also the structure of ownership that might surround that. I think the other starting point that I would say is that you need cryptocurrency to be able to purchase NFTs ordinarily, right? And so the anti-money laundering, counter-terror finance sort of stuff that applies generally to exchanges as the on-ramps to the crypto world are going to apply, but not directly. So, it's not like if you're offering sort of an NFT for sale that you're going to necessarily have to comply with those regulations. It's the exchange that's providing the finance for people to be able to do it that are going to be complying with that regulation. So in that sense, it's a bit derivative. So I think that's really the starting point. I think as far as the law is concerned and regulation is concerned, it's a bit more speculative now. And what rights, if any, flow from an NFT, and what could they do? So I think that's probably where we're at.
That's really interesting in terms of how nascent, I guess, the structures and regulatory standards surrounding this are. And again, we see those sort of institutional frameworks needing to catch up potentially with where the decentralized technology space is.
I think the other thing that I would say is that I guess that my answer was premised on the idea of regulation coming from, I guess, the state or a government of some kind. What we do know is that these NFTs are being regulated by code standards, right, and by technical standards, so that there is some level of regulation there, right? But it's coming more as the kind of code as law idea of regulation rather than it being enforced by some sort of regulatory regulatory agency in the traditional sense.
Yeah, and I guess that brings some flexibility to your initial kind of point of like, well, what is an NFT? And I'm interested to loop back to kind of who decides that and the process for that in a sort of state legal sense. Marta, what are your initial observations about this space?
Thanks, Kelsey. I completely agree with Aaron in the sense that it looks at the moment, because it's so emerging, the Wild West in terms of regulation. And also noting that sometimes we tend to think of regulation at the state level, as Aaron suggested. But in fact, regulation is a multi-layered concept where you have from self-regulatory practices to standards to then the intervention of the states and even the supranational state level, coming up with regulatory instruments. When it comes to standards, obviously NFT has already predefined standards, and that helps to set up the scenario. But at the same time, there are areas even in that level that are not fully fledged, if I may say. And for example, metadata is one of those areas where I don't think there is a consensus yet on which is the best solution when it comes to metadata standards. But by that, I mean that usually NFTs point to some metadata, and that metadata points to an URL where the asset that NFT is representing is located. It can be a physical space, but can be a website, obviously. Those URLs may be broken in a few years, may not be responsive. So how NFTs make sure that the metadata files that they are pointing to will not be broken URLs, and how, in addition to that, the links that are made to the digital assets are also robust. These are the things that, when it comes to regulation, are also important. And as we see this space evolving, we'll probably see more agreements in that space on which are the most adequate solutions to that. And obviously, there'll be also regulations when it comes to, well, could I mint an NFT, sorry, in different marketplaces? That's probably something. It shouldn't be happening. So how marketplaces coordinate among them to make sure that the market is compliant, in the sense that no one should be able to duplicate NFTs of same assets. Things like that. I think that's going to be very important as we progress in that space.
Sure, I really like that thinking in terms of that multi-layered regulation from the state to the kind of how the communities are going to self-regulate or regulate each other in this as well. And that was a fantastic Twitter thread, I think, that I saw you share on IPFS storage and NFTs, which I'll find and put in the show notes.
Yes, that could be great, because there's an active discussion. You remind me of these on the Twitter community around these topics of metadata standards, JSON files, which are the best solutions, and it's very interesting to follow. So if you can link to that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Lizzie, can you give the listeners an introduction into your perspective on this space?
Thanks, Kelsey. Yeah, so coming from the tax space, it's interesting, what already Aaron and Marta have shared. And, with tax law, we have a specific set of words and terms that we need to interpret and apply to these new circumstances. NFTs weren't really what was in mind when tax law was written. And more importantly, the way we interpret the tax law is largely looking towards case law. So we're looking at what's happened in the past. So when we've got these new circumstances and new kinds of transactions happening, it can be really challenging to try and work out how these new things fit into existing law, because a lot of the time the law is quite general. And so these can, in fact, fit in existing law, but the uncertainty and the lack of past precedent to understand how we should do things, is a really interesting and evolving way. And we've already seen guidance released by the ATO to indicate, for example, what Bitcoin is from a tax perspective. And now we need to kind of have a look to see how that extends to NFTs, and to the extent that they're the same, to the extent that they're different. But keep in mind, one taxpayer's use and holding of an NFT will look different to another taxpayer. So the tax treatment is really going to vary between taxpayers and the actual NFT in question. So there's this really interesting dynamic going on between not only the regulation, but the actual item in question, an NFT or general crypto asset, as well as the actual taxpayer and what they're doing. And I think it's a really interesting space.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've seen NFTs used for, as cultural expressions, as kind of like marks of sort of provenance on, everything from art to scholarship, as a way to signify partial ownership of assets, as a way to sell carbon tokens that accompany art, which I think I mentioned in the last podcast. So I'm curious to know, from the state perspective, perhaps towards Aaron and Lizzie, what is the general process and who is involved in deciding how to treat these assets?
Good question. I think, again, it comes back to what is the NFT, right? So if what it is representing, say, ownership in land, as an intangible kind of thing that represents some sort of physical, real world existence in a real estate asset, then that's going to be a whole lot of different sort of laws, regulations, regulatory authorities will come to bear on that question, compared to if, say, we're talking about a piece of artwork that has been tokenized in that format and being sold. Marta has commented before about duplication of ownership. So say for instance, so you went on to OpenSea or one of those sort of platforms, and you wanted to purchase this sort of digital artwork, and as part of that purchase, it said, it sort of represented that this is the only one. You've got the kind of the exclusive deal here. I haven't duplicated anywhere else. As it turns out, that representation was false. Well, that's then going to be the consumer law sort of bodies and the consumer law would be where your legal remedy kind of lies, right? So really this question of who's involved, what laws are involved, what regulators are involved. Do you have a private legal action as opposed to a regulatory legal action? That's really going to depend on what it is and the circumstances around that. It's also going to depend on whether the sort of contracting party or not. Like if I know someone is located in Australia and I know the identity of that person, that makes my ability to rely on the Australian legal system really strong and really practical. If I'm dealing with someone that is offshore or someone that I don't know, that might be, all I know is kind of a sort of a pen name or something like that, then that's going to be more difficult to sort of enforce legal rights in those cases. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but the answer to every legal question, Kelsey, is it depends.
Totally agree. But yeah, and I can just continue examples of that, Kelsey, in that, going back to who the taxpayer is really, really important in the context. So if you are a large company, you're not only going to be dealing with the tax obligations of these kind of transactions, but also accounting standards. If you're listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, there's specific compliance there. If the NFTs or crypto assets, regardless of whether they're fungible or not, if they're being provided as part of an employment remuneration, then it brings in a whole new bucket of requirements and regulations. A company versus a trust versus an individual versus a partnership. Well, it kind of, the umbrella of regulation that's going to surround the taxpayer is going to be a different mix in essence.
And so I think what some of this says is that, you've got to do your due diligence if you're putting a lot of money up here, right? Like if you're just playing around with a few $100s, kind of playing around in this space, like you're not going to go and get professional advice on that, right? But if you're making a purchase, we've seen some of these NFTs sell for like millions, tens of millions of dollars, right? If you were putting up that kind of money in any other commercial deal or any other purchase in any other realm of your life, if you were buying, say, physical land, if you were buying a $60 mansion, $60 million mansion, you'd probably get a property report done. You would probably have a look at what planning overlays applied or what easements were on the title. You'd probably do a title search, to make sure that the seller actually owned it and what encumbrances were on the title and those sorts of things. You do that, by the way, for a $100,000 property. You'd probably do even more due diligence if you were talking about $60 million. So I'm always a bit bamboozled by people in this space that are putting up this amount of money without doing that due diligence, because it can be quite complex questions here.
That's a great point. I wish we had sponsors. It would be a fantastic time to to spruik some local firms that could give you some advice, but we don't.
Yeah.
We're authentic.
Potential sponsors, your ad here.
Call us. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and that kind of comes back to the code is law thing that you mentioned in the beginning of this is cyberspace, and a lot of people think that they're completely free, like beyond the law, or outside of the law, I guess. But you mentioned property, so in what ways could NFTs be property, or what are the other kind of potential directions of how they could be treated?
Yeah, great question. I think this is really fundamental to understanding, I think, the legal significance of NFTs. So lawyers tend to categorize property in two types. We've got real property, that is real estate, land, buildings, those sorts of things. And we've got personal property. We can then break up personal property into two other categories. Tangible property, that is the things you can pick up and move around and carry with you. So think, a laptop computer, a car, those sorts of things that you can see and touch. And then there's a category of personal property called intangible property, and that's those things that you can't necessarily sort of pick up and touch, but we recognize that there are ownership rights that attach to owning something. So a great example of this is ownership in shares, where you buy shares in a company. That's not something you can kind of pick up and touch, but you get legal rights that attach from your ownership of that. Historically, in law, there's been different, I guess, legal regimes that and different jurisprudence that applies to real property versus personal property. And I think NFTs live in that intangible kind of space. And that, I think, is true even if the asset that it represents might live somewhere else. So, as I said, you could have an NFT that represents a physical artwork. So the physical artwork would be tangible property, but how you're showing your ownership of that is in an intangible sort of NFT form. So I guess that's what sort of makes NFTs different to other types of intangible property, is that they might point to ownership somewhere else in the broad sort of property law scheme. But I think that's probably where it lies. The question then, and this is now in the realm of complete speculation, is, well, what rights then flow from that? And how do I show that I own it? Because in the personal property space, the old saying, possession is 9/10 of the law. It's not. That's not like sort of some sort of true legal doctrine. Instead, what it sort of says is that if you possess personal property, the assumption is that you own it, unless someone else can kind of come along with some credible evidence to rebut that presumption. So if I'm walking down the street, or I'm driving my car that's registered in my name, the assumption is that I own that car. And so, but how do you show possession of an NFT? How do you show possession of the asset or the object that is signified, by the NFT? Because as we know, when we have assets that are, I guess, on a blockchain, we might think about cryptocurrency. We don't possess that in the same way that we possess that in a physical wallet, like cash in our actual wallets, or cash in our actual bank accounts. So I think we can categorize it as intangible property, but then there are heaps of questions that then flow from that.
Yeah, well, also, you could say that it's in my digital wallet, but if that is on a centralized exchange, though you don't own the keys to that. And same with a lot of mobile wallets as well. So even if it's in your wallet, if it disappears, but you didn't own the keys in the first place because you kept it in a custodial place, then your questions ensue.
Right. And so what possession really looks like in the blockchain space is control. And so I think one of the questions, not just for NFTs, but actually even for cryptocurrency, is how do you prove that you control it without sending it to someone? Right. That's the ultimate way you can show that you control that that address, is that hey, I've sent you some coins from that address, right? But how do you show that? That otherwise, that's a big problem in this space.
Marta, did you have more to add there?
No, that reminds me of, I think the very useful distinctions that Aaron is making between possession and property, and the fact that NFTs may disrupt, in a legal sense, our traditional conceptions of what is to own an asset, what is to possess an asset. I think this is not new to NFTs. I think that there were examples where you could buy an ebook, download it to your e-reader, and then disappeared. There was a case where that happened. So even though you had purchased the book and was sitting in your e-reader, eventually you couldn't read it because it disappeared from there. So that's not entirely new to digital assets. to me, the irony, going back to possession and ownership, and the irony is that in NFTs, storage, for example, is as important as in physical assets. Whether the asset your NFT is pointing to is physical or digital, the way it's stored and how you can access it is all the more important. But I think we can go wild and imagine different ways to take possession or to own things that we haven't conceived so far. Imagine for an instant that, I don't know, the French state decides to tokenize the Mona Lisa and distribute NFTs to all French citizens over 18 years old, right? And everybody has an NFT pointing to that asset that has been custodied for centuries in the Louvre. Well, these people may have a claim, they have a certificate of ownership, but they might never possess the asset. So maybe what I'm just speculating, obviously, maybe what we can see in the future with NFTs, if this moves so forward, is that, as I said, we will have to think differently on the relationships between ownership and possession, and how does that mean that NFTs add another layer of property rights to the blockchain. These are things that we still, I think, need to wrap our heads around.
Definitely. Lizzie, how do these questions about categorization of assets work for tax purposes here?
Yeah, so from a tax perspective, it often doesn't matter whether it's intangible or tangible property, or even legal or illegal in that sense, in the sense that we can, the tax law has its own categorization system. Generally speaking, for CGT purposes, it can capture land, it can capture physical property, it can capture intangible goodwill, etc., and certainly Bitcoin and NFTs. But it has its own special rules and subcategorizations, which with similar language as Aaron has already spoken about in terms of personal use assets and collectibles. And these kind of assets have particular rules, exemptions, and things that need to apply. But personal use assets aren't just simply something that you might have in your home. It could be, a couch, a TV, an Xbox, anything like that, a rug. But not only does it need to be used for your own personal use and enjoyment, but done so for essentially the majority of the ownership period for that taxpayer. But with regard to personal use assets, we do have a distinction for collectibles. So collectibles can include things like artwork. And the question that I find really fascinating here is the blurring or the crossover between personal use assets and artwork in the NFT space. We've seen the likes of Beeple and Tweets being sold recently. But do they meet the definition of artwork? A rug on the floor in your lounge room, it could be used as a rug and therefore a personal use asset. But if you have that rug up on the wall, then we're looking at the aesthetic qualities. And so, again, it goes back to the particular circumstances and what the taxpayer is doing with it that becomes more important rather than whether it's tangible or intangible. There's lots of questions that have flown around about Bitcoin being personal use asset in the sense of being used to acquire personal use assets, whether it's tickets or general goods. But for NFTs, it is the thing that we're considering the categorization for. So it's a little bit more unique. And not only that is where, as Aaron said at the start, we're already in the Bitcoin space here. We're already transacting with Ether, with Bitcoin, with other cryptocurrencies. So we're essentially having double ups of transactions that we're having to contemplate within this space. And the concept of this control and the rights that we've been speaking about is quite interesting in regards to when things are lost or stolen. Losing your key to get into your wallet, is in itself a huge problem that can lead to tax implications. So it's a really interesting space. Did you have anything further to add there, Aaron?
Marta?
No,
I feel like I've talked enough.
I definitely agree with Lizzie in that there are so many potential opportunities for NFTs to apply to so many different assets that I think this is only the start of what we can foresee. Obviously, there are cases that are already well known, artworks, but potentially you could NFTize, or whatever the verb should be, many different objects. I'm happy not to be an expert in taxes, because that could be really, really complex to assess and manage. But from a legal perspective, it's very exciting to see that may happen, and somehow that may disrupt our traditional concepts of property and ownership, and especially in the digital space. As I said before, storage, it's a very important aspect of this, not just for real assets or physical assets, sorry, but also for digital assets. You want to preserve them in the cyberspace the same way you would preserve them in a physical space. Again, these are issues that are not yet resolve, and where I expect to see a lot of innovation coming up in the next few years, if this is going to take off. That's my take on this.
And Marta, the issues that you raised in regards to the metadata, if URLs are broken and no longer work, that raises an interesting point from a tax perspective, in the sense that, has that asset come to an end, even though the NFT is in a sense intact, but it's just that the actual metadata that's not, and it's the metadata that is that aesthetically pleasing, or it's the gaming function that we've purchased that from. So if we've got it no longer operating, it's dead, the server's gone, it's vanished, which there are a lot of NFTs out there that are no longer operating. So it does raise some interesting circumstances. But the unlimited use cases here create really a multitude of different questions.
So coming back to some of those sort of speculative scenarios, what rights could flow from ownership of an NFT, Aaron?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I might loop back into Marta's example of tokenizing the Mona Lisa. So our colleague Chris Berg, I'm going to verbal him and try and give hopefully an adequate kind of summary of what his argument is. So he says that, well, you can separate out the ownership of an asset from the rights that you might have to, I guess, copy and display and that sort of thing. And he used the example of the Mona Lisa, saying, well, everyone just kind of uses that image. And it's so broadly and widely shared that, sharing those things doesn't really detract from your ownership if you own the Mona Lisa. It doesn't really detract from that. If anything, it probably makes it more popular and more valuable, the fact that, it's being shared. And look, there's something to be said for that, but if you own a piece of artwork, you have the exclusive right to display that, and you can choose to do what you like with that. Now, a lot of people donate those things to museums for public display as an act of sort of philanthropy, and they get their sort of name somewhere in a donor's book or something like that. But regardless of what an individual might choose to do with that asset, if you own this really expensive piece of tangible artwork, you've still got exclusive rights over that. If you owned the copyright in it, so copyright can expire after periods of time. Let's leave that aside. Let's say it's a newly created piece of artwork where copyright is still relevant. One of the rights you have as an owner of that copyright is to authorize the reproduction of that. So if someone is sharing unauthorized copies, you as the copyright owner have a legal ability to bring, I guess, private enforcement action for copyright infringement against someone. Right? So regardless of whether people choose to do that or not, that is one of the ownership rights that you have in, say, a tangible piece of artwork or a copyright in, say, a song or something like that. I guess what troubles me in the NFT space right now is that, okay, if someone wants to, make an NFT out of their first tweet that they posted on Twitter, they can do that. But so long as it's still on the internet, if someone just like screenshots it and mints an NFT of that screenshot, and that person then posts it up, you could then take a screenshot of a screenshot, and you don't really lose anything in that in terms of what it is in the digital environment. And there's only you can't really screenshot that with tangible pieces of artwork. And so I think an unanswered question is, well, what does this mean for copyright? What if you own an NFT and it's some sort of artwork, whether that's visual art, whether it's music or whatever it might be. If you own that, what does that mean for your copyright ability? I certainly would like to see that that issue fleshed out and improved. Otherwise, ownership is kind of meaningless. For at least from a legal perspective, it might not be meaningless from an economic perspective of this idea of. So Chris Berg recently has written a piece on this for Cointelegraph, and where he sort of says, well, you can own things as kind of consumption goods in and of themselves. Yeah, that might be true from an economic point of view, but from a legal point of view, what rights really flow from that ownership? Because that's what ownership is. That might have been a bit long-winded, Kelsey, but hopefully that kind of demonstrates the real kind of complex legal problem, I think, that we need to resolve.
No, it's a great point to make. I think it was a CoinDesk piece, and I'll link to that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
And it comes back to, I guess what we've all sort of emphasized here is this lack of accountability or recourse as people would sort of traditionally expect it in a sort of state-enforced scenario. Marta, I really liked the earlier point you made about sort of communities self-regulating or governing each other. Is there a theoretical framework or sort of examples from other communities or online communities that you can point to about this example of self-regulation?
I guess there are many examples, but this is not to say that these marketplaces are already coordinating. I'm sure that I've read somewhere that they are already coordinating at some level to avoid duplication of NFTs and things like that. So something is already happening in that space. Perhaps we should dig deeper into that topic. But examples of online communities that are able to self-regulate, I think they're plentiful. If you start looking at open source communities, open software, this is a perfect example of communities on the internet who have evolved over the years and have consolidated different practices, self-regulation practices, and so on. Then you have even bigger communities such as the Wikipedias, not just one, but many, as there are many multi language Wikipedias, all of them again coordinating, creating their own rules, even their dispute resolution mechanisms to resolve editing issues. So yes, in a way that there's no shortage of online communities self-regulating, that some of the practices or lessons could be also adopted by these emerging communities in the NFT space, definitely.
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and I feel like it could be a whole nother podcast.
Indeed.
Just to go around the virtual room, I think we've given people a nice sort of taster on these topics. And to Lizzie's earlier point, we don't want to bore them with taxation, which I don't think we have by any means. But any final comments from each of you?
To me, apart from all the legal issues and economic issues, tax issues that both Aaron and Lizzie have raised, there is an interesting aspect that I never thought at the beginning, and that's that with NFTs, they can also be approached as something like a monetization device or price discovery mechanism for things that didn't have a price at the beginning. So who would have thought that a tweet could be something that could be monetized? And is there a market for that? I'm not sure. As this area moves on, we may be seeing again monetization of assets that didn't have a price or didn't have this aspect. And to me, that's also an interesting standpoint to look at NFTs. Like, what's next?
Just to build off that from a tax perspective, it really goes down to, I think, the context in which the NFT is placed, and not only that, the actual NFT itself. So, if you're carrying on a business, you might be looking towards trading stock provisions as opposed to the CGT consequences. If this is from the provision of employment benefits, you're looking towards, how does that fit into whether it's a fringe benefits tax or otherwise. But more importantly, I think, what the NFT is itself, is it bundled? We are seeing NFTs with elements of actual fungible tokens, linked in with them. We've seen that as early as CryptoKitties having that ability to be crypto composable by adding a water dish to the asset, having all those kind of extra bits that you can add on, and that bundling you also need to take a close look at and determine, are there particular components of note that need to be pulled apart to really understand the ramifications. But looking at, particularly around cryptocurrencies generally, there's been a lot of confusion around whether these things are personal use assets. I think, as we get into NFTs, we see a lot more. We'll see a lot more of that characterization, but the dichotomy of whether it's art or play, and CryptoKitties can look really cute. Are you getting them for that cute factor, or are you getting them to play? or have you just been running on speculation? You've seen all this craze, the fad as the prices go up. Are you just playing on that? And from a tax perspective, those kind of characterizations have real implications for how it's treated, and it can certainly get complex. So just because they're cute and cuddly doesn't mean they're outside of the scope of taxation.
Kelsey, I think I'd just sort of close by saying that law is an evolutionary process, right? The law is not static, and new circumstances arise that mean that the law has to really develop new categories of things. And what's interesting about the blockchain space more broadly is what we're seeing is that evolutionary process has shifted from 50, 100 years ago, that was playing out in the courtroom. And it was judges that were having to decide, what these new things were. The speed at which development takes place now means that it's technologists, it's innovators, it's people playing around with different ERC token standards that are creating the law in this space and what rights might flow out of those tokens. So I think it's a really exciting space and an evolutionary process going on before our eyes here, and it'll be interesting to see where that ends up.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to each of our guests, Marta, Poblet, Aaron Lean and Lizzie Morton, for your valuable perspectives. And thank you for joining us for this episode of Mint and Burn. You can check out the show notes and further research at rmitblockchain.io.